Good morning, chaps. How are you? Hello. Welcome to my house. Welcome to this video and welcome to my new YouTube channel, which has been designed basically for us to continue our discourse, whether there are things happening in the wider world that are beyond our control and interrupt our classroom learning. If you are my student. If you are not my student, as I said in my first video, welcome. And I suppose apologies because I'm not a professional YouTuber, so just bear with me, but you are very welcome, of course. Today we are going to be talking about something which is new for the IB this year with the new curriculum, which is the IO. Obviously, in the previous syllabus, we had the IOC, which is the individual oral commentary, but the structure and the format of the IO shifts this slightly, and it has to do very much with the aims of the course, which if you look at the handbook itself, you can see that they are stated. I'm going to just refer so that I don't miss anything or pick a wrong word. Okay, so the actual aims of the course itself are to know, understand and interpret, to analyse and evaluate, and to communicate. And so the IO, which is a 10-minute individual presentation on two texts, one literary and one non-literary, and then a 5-minute discussion with the teacher about the global issue and those texts and the way that they intersect together. So that's the IO, and it's very exciting, but there are some implications embedded in this change, which I think we need to start thinking about quite early on in the course. The first of these, obviously, is that we're looking at how a literary text and a non-literary text show or intersect or have implications in terms of a global issue. So the actual prompt itself that all students will have to address, is as follows. And again, I'm going to read this directly. Examine the ways in which the global issue of your choice is presented through the content and form of one of the literary works and one of the non-literary texts that you have studied. So obviously you can choose any literary text or any non-literary text as long as we have studied it. And you are going to have to connect that to a global issue. So obviously the first implication of that, other than having to study literary text and non-literary text, is that you also have to be very aware of global issues. I know it sounds really obvious, but not everybody always is. You need to know about what's going on in the world and how texts can then intersect or interrelate with those things. So very early on in the course, we need to make sure that you're being really proactive in terms of the things that you're reading, that you know what's going on in the world, that you understand the significance of references to things like yesterday's news, where Macron, Boris Johnson and Trudeau were standing in a little huddle and they were filmed laughing at Donald Trump and the manner in which he speaks during press conferences. So things like that. We need to know about the Me Too movement. We need to know about what's happening in terms of, I suppose, things like abortion regulation. We need to know what's happening in terms of war, refugee crisis, the environment, people tweeting yesterday about Greta having a highly expensive animal skin chair in her house and therefore not being very sustainable. We need to know all about these other kinds of things that are happening so that we can actually understand how texts intersect and how they express or explore those ideas. So in terms of what a global issue actually is, it needs to be significant on a wide or a larger scale. It needs to be transnational. They need to connect us on a deeper human level. So for me, this is actually quite inspiring. I think this is quite a nice way of looking at text. Sometimes people don't see the relevance of studying things like poetry or a play or something like that. This is a little bit narrow, and what the IO is trying to do is show that you really understand the relevance or the significance of texts on a human level, which is really, really nice. The third characteristic, I suppose, of what a global issue actually is that it has an impact which is felt in everyday local context. So yes, it is wider, it does connect us on a deeper human level, but it needs to be felt on a day-to-day basis as well. So we need to start thinking about this. It means we need to be proactive, we need to be open-minded, we need to be incredibly curious about the things that we're reading, and also, I suppose, quite voracious in the kinds of information that we're looking for. What sources are you finding your information from? We can't exist in a sort of tiny intellectual bubble and do well on the IO. So from this point onwards, we need to be sort of collecting information about what's going on in the world and why things are significant and how they might intersect. That's the first implication. Second implication, I would say, we also need to be really curious and engaged with texts. What this means is that we need to be active in terms of mining them, understanding the layers of meaning that they have, and also the manner in which we receive messages from text and how that might be very much related to context, but also how messages are constructed inside those texts. So we also need to understand the way that our individual reaction can actually have an impact on the way that we make connections, and we need to be able to make insightful connections between text and context, whether those texts were written 500 years ago or yesterday. The third thing that this means is we also need to be very unsnobbish about text. We need to be prepared to engage with every single kind of text that there is. A chunk from Shakespeare cannot be on a higher level in terms of this particular activity than a blog about the James Charles beauty scandal of 2019. Everything is about message, everything is about context, everything is important and everything is relevant and everything is connected. So we're going to take kind of intellectual snobbery and leave it to one side. We don't need it anymore. We're looking at message and how we receive message and how message is constructed inside context. We also need to be able to organize and control the language of observation and evaluation and interpretation and conclusion and linking. So there's a very specific language set that we use to do this on an academic level. So we need to be able to control academic register. So this is really the fourth implication that I would say that this has. We need to make sure that our own language use, as we are speaking, communicating, organizing ideas, is where it needs to be in terms of the criteria, and it needs to be academic enough to really represent the sophistication of our own thinking as well. And that's something that's quite sad, I think, sometimes, when people's ideas are amazing and they make these fantastic connections and links and they interpret beautifully and it's clear that they really know what they're talking about. But the language that they're using to do this doesn't really fit the task itself. So we're going to talk a little bit about that today as well. So there are 4 ideas that I really kind of focused on in terms of implication of the shift into the I.O. and the criteria for the I.O. Number 1, that we need to know what global issues are. Sounds obvious, but you would be very surprised about how much some people know, but also how little other people know in terms of what's happening in the world. Second implication, we need to be curious and engaged with literary texts. This means mining them for information, not being content with the first descriptive communication about something that we've read. We need to be prepared to really dig deeper and find kind of not hidden meanings, but deeper, more sophisticated meanings, not just first impressions. And that requires a certain level of academic discipline and resilience as well. Third implication, we need to be very unsnobbish. We need to be prepared to talk about any kind of text, visual or written, and we need to be prepared to analyze it with the same seriousness and the same academic rigor that we might instinctively or have had more training in analysing literary texts. So the same rigour that we use to approach a poem, we're going to use the same rigour to approach a non-literary text, and also be aware of the meta-language that we use to do that. What's the language we use to talk about a photograph? It's as important as expressions like alliteration or metaphor when we're talking about a literary text. So we need to know all of the meta-language to be able to represent our ideas properly. And then the fourth, this idea of representing our ideas properly, organising and controlling our language so that we are actually structuring our approach to text and making it very clear that we can communicate on a sophisticated level with regard both to literary text, non-literary text, and global issues. So, thinking routines can actually help us to do this. We use a lot of thinking routines in primary, but very often in secondary they don't get used very often. So what I was thinking about was this idea of asking ourselves questions to make sure that we're really exploring literary text, non-literary text, and the global issue fully. So the first thing that we need is to observe. And so the question, obviously, that we're going to be asking ourselves is, what do I see? And this is basically just engaging with the text on a very sort of instant level, brainstorming just what you see and writing it down, annotating it. The next question that you're going to be asking yourselves in terms of a thinking routine is, what does this mean? This is the analytical part. The third part is going to be interpretation. What can I conclude from this? And the fourth one is going to be, how does this relate to my global issue? What's the link? And so there's going to be 4 steps in this thinking routine. And I think this is where sometimes people fall down a little bit. And they actually fell down a little bit on the IOC with this as well. People are very, very good at observing and describing and narrating what they see and what they can identify. But they're not very good sometimes. I'm not saying never, but sometimes they're not very good at then pushing themselves to take this 3 steps further through analysis, interpretation, and into linking it to a wider scale, taking it onto a sort of a more macro level. And so we are going to be forcing ourselves to do this thinking routine, 4 steps, boom, 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 boom. Obviously, the first step is to engage with the text itself. What do I see? That's a very easy one. Then we go from that to what does it mean? From what does it mean to what can I conclude? And from what can I conclude to what does it mean for my global issue? Once we've gone through that process, it will become very, very automatic. And we won't be satisfied just with what do I see? If you see a pattern of language, for example, what does that mean? How are you going to interpret it? How does that feed into or intersect with messages about the global issue itself? So we're going to be, I think, pushing ourselves quite a lot to do this, because it's very easy sometimes just to stick with the path of least resistance. But forcing ourselves to use a thinking routine helps build in that academic rigor that we're going to need to do well on the IO. Okay? We also need to understand what the language of those thinking routines is as well. And so things like, when we're talking about something that we observe, we're going to be using phrases like, I observe, obviously, I see, I notice, I can identify, I can recognize, things even as basic as in line 5 or in the photo on the top left. The composition or the positioning when we're describing things within a text is going to be very important as well. In terms of the language of analysis, this is where we're looking at things like this reveals, this evokes, this creates a feeling of, this corresponds to, this means, this creates a tone of. So there we're thinking about really what the impact is. Why has that language been selected and what the purpose of it is, and how does it relate to the general feeling of the text and the general message of the text itself as well, whether it's a literary text or a non-literary text. And then we go on to the language of interpretation. Things like, so we can conclude that, as a result, this indicates that. So you're sort of summing this up. So when we're interpreting, we're trying to pull all of the threads of our analysis together and draw a conclusion about how this has an impact in the text itself. So we're trying to pull everything into sort of a concise conclusion, making it very clear that the things that we've observed, the analysis that comes from that observation, leads directly into a kind of conclusion about the text itself, whether it's a literary text or a non-literary text. And then, obviously, we need to make it very explicit what the link is to the global issue and what the impact of that is. So, what I have done for you is I've created a little chart. The idea of this is to actually make our thinking visible. So as you're going into a literary text or a non-literary text and thinking about moving into the IO, we are going to be observing in the first column. Then we're going to draw a little arrow, move into analysis, asking ourselves that question, what does it mean? Interpretation, what can I conclude? And then the final arrow is going to be the link. How does this relate to my global issue? And by doing this, not being just satisfied with identifying what we observe, but actually extending and exploring further, we're going to be in a very, very good position when we actually get to the IO next year. So we're going to be approaching, I think, the IO through visible thinking routines, which is very exciting. So what I need you guys to do, if you're my student, if you're not my student, don't do it. What I need you guys to do is go to the link with the document and actually read through the notes from this, and then you're going to apply it to a non-literary text and just get into the habit of doing this 4-step thinking and really making sure that you're exploring all of your amazing ideas and are able to communicate them effectively using the correct language. Okay, so I hope this has been useful, and again, I'm supposed to say hit the like button or subscribe button or ring the bell or whatever, and thank you very much and see you next time. Bye bye.